So thanks it's really good to be back in Australia. Is that really loud? Or is it just, okay. I'll stand back a little bit. I tend to be loud anyway. It's been a wonderful event, and first I want to recognize the traditional owners of this land and also thank the conference organizers for inviting me. And it's been great to listen to the talks yesterday and the keynote speakers. And there's certainly, obviously, no shortage of expertise, I don't know if that's mine, in this room about digital technologies and cultural and linguistic diversity. So I'm gonna offer my perspective over the next, hopefully 45 minutes or so. I do wanna leave some time for questions. So the title of my talk today, Gather, Create, Share, Respectfully and Responsibly, the Ethics in the Digital Ecosystem, really grew out of my long-term work with Indigenous people globally, but specifically the Warramungu community here in Central Australia, in Tennant Creek. And how many of you have been to Tennant Creek? Because you're almost all Australians. A few, yay, because usually when I get to Australia and I land in Sydney or wherever and I give the customs guy my passport and he asks me where I'm going and I say Tennant Creek, he looks at me like, why? Why are you going there? You look like a nice American person. Why are you going there? And I find that, there's sort of this, aura thing around a place like Tennant Creek, and I love it. And I started working there in 1995, which seems like forever ago now. And I've been lucky to be back almost every year. My youngest son, who is now 9, was born there, and so we have lots of connections to the place. And it's those connections and the lessons that I learned from the collaborations that I forged, particularly with the Warramungu women there, that really had the most significant impact on me, both as a scholar and personally, and also on what we're talking about today and the 3 overarching themes of this conference. So connecting, collaborating, and creating. And I want to talk about those specifically as we think about the intersections of Indigenous knowledge and social media platforms and archival platforms. So how can we put those 2 things together? But before I go there, because that's sort of where we want to get to, I want to highlight some of the popular or mainstream ways of thinking about connecting, collaborating, and creating. So in order for us to then play off of that and see how the Indigenous systems might help us disrupt those normal views. Obviously, the normal views are the ones we see every day, the popular narratives, and so we sort of forget they're there. So I'm also a professor, so it's my job to remind everybody of the obvious and what is there. So in popular narratives about the digital ecosystem, connecting is a big thing, right? And connecting is mainly about the objects. So what is it that we have connecting? And it's also about the scope. And our scope tends to be, we think of it in terms of this global scope. And then also about speed, right? We always want our internet speed to be faster. we never want it to be slower. And the inverse, of course, is also true, right? A lack of connection, or what is sort of all too commonly referred to still as the digital divide, and maybe we'll talk about the problems with that term later. But in these narratives, it's almost always the case that Indigenous peoples are already on the wrong side of that divide from the beginning. And it's obviously a convenient narrative, it's a false narrative. It erases the unprecedented work that we've seen over the last couple days, and that I'm gonna highlight today. And it downplays what's happening on the ground, and it just sort of pushes that half over and says, okay, we already know that they're sort of hopeless and maybe we'll allow them to catch up, but we don't see the creation of what's going on. Similarly, popular narratives emphasize collaborating as a model of partnership where individuals come together to form a whole, right? So collaboration tends to be about hybridization, absorbing, and coming to one sort of common goal. And it's about bringing in multiple perspectives focused around creating, but usually in the popular narratives, it's about creating a product, right? Something that's usable and generally marketable. And I think Roy and Jeff talked about this yesterday, sort of like, well, do we really, are companies going to translate their products into how many, well, who's gonna buy that? How many consumers do we have? So particularly in the digital ecosystem, one of the questions seems to be, is something scalable? So if you've ever been in development meetings about software in particular, and I'm sure Michael has, the question is, can it scale? Meaning, can it get bigger? Can it serve more people? Can it continue to grow and expand? And this is generally based on a consumer-driven market mentality where creation is a mandate for both individuals and groups, usually whether they be corporations or small startups. So taken together within the popular digital ecosystem then, connecting, collaborating, and creating privilege, generally speaking, largely Western agendas and priorities about individual content creators. So the I. In Facebook and YouTube and whatever, it's the I. So individual creators and connection speed based on a platform of openness, where openness is automatically seen to be a public good. And I know I work with librarians a lot, I work with archivists, and openness is something that's a professional standard. It's a mandate. Particularly you work in public institutions, you want to make things open. I want to sort of try to complicate that today. Within this narrative field, internet activists, digital pundits, and scholars have largely been silent about alternative models. Part of this is because of a sort of general love affair with the idea of an open web. It sounds really good, right? In particular, though, many have mistaken the possibilities of open access, particularly in things like publishing, right, in relation to the tools and infrastructure. So openness of tools, openness of infrastructure, and this is what we were sort of talking about yesterday. It's great that you can come to this building and have free Wi-Fi and not have to pay for it. Okay, and it's great that you can come here people can come if it's raining outside, you have a building. So that type of openness versus the openness of content or knowledge. These are two separate things. We should not lump them under the same umbrella of open access. And now librarians know this tension well. Librarians are in the thick of these dialogues about how to create a balance between access to already public materials while also representing diverse needs of specific multicultural communities. I was just in Vancouver speaking at the IFLA conference, and it was all about Indigenous knowledge in libraries. So your international organizations, your national organizations, librarians are struggling with this. How do we deal with Indigenous knowledge? How do we deal with community knowledge that may not fit this open access public model? So the trouble is not with the idea of open access. So sometimes when I give these talks, people are tweeting, Christen is against open access. I'm not. So if you're tweeting, don't say that. I'm not against open access. I think we need to be critical of open access and the sort of large umbrella that it casts. So this sort of large shadow that it casts has short-circuited debates about the various types of openness that I'll talk about later, and the limits on access that are not oppressive and not greed-driven. So this isn't Sony shutting things down, or this isn't the American recording industry, okay? There's other types of limits on access that are not about corporations, that are not about greed, that are not about being oppressive. Those things do exist, and they're real. We also need to bring in these others. So what I'm going to suggest today is that we need to infuse this digital ecosystem and these narratives with alternative ethical models that will provide us with a guidepost for collaborating, connecting, and creating based on the recognition of Indigenous systems of knowledge circulation, creation, and preservation. Systems that are in no way homogeneous, right? We already know they're not. But they nevertheless give us pause when we too quickly celebrate the knowledge of the crowd and forget about the wisdom of the elders and the local communities, for whom the ideals of connection, collaboration, and creation revolve more around knowledge embedded in the land and the ancestors than it does in sort of information bits and bytes. And we saw so many wonderful examples of this yesterday that help us get a different perspective on the digital ecosystem. So I'm going to run through a few today. For example, much like the Cherokee case that we saw yesterday from Roy and Jeff, First Voices out of Canada provides mobile dictionaries, chat tools for dozens of local languages driven by the communities themselves. So this isn't the corporation, this isn't the entity or the organization or the government deciding. These are the communities. And again, the communities come together, they choose the members who are going to do the translation. They even decide on the content. So if you go to the First Voices site and you choose on any one of the First Nations languages that are in there, you'll find all different types of materials because the communities decide, well, what's going to work best for us? So they may not all want the chat function. They may not all want a dictionary. They may not all want certain types of games. They choose themselves, and then they decide if they want to put it up online or not. And similarly, the Reciprocal Research Network is a collaboration between several First Nations communities in Canada and many public museums, libraries, and archives actually around the world. These directly link communities to collections. The key for this platform, however, is how it emerged. It emerged from the desire of all participants to base the project on the principles of respect for the originating community's different knowledge and value systems, as well as those for partner museums. So it didn't start with the technology that said we should open up our collections and give access. It started from this coming together of these communities that's saying, how can we work on something together to provide a respectful type of access to these collections? So the network began from a position of both respecting and incorporating different value systems into the very core of the technical system, not the other way around. Similarly, Asuma TV is a platform for creating and distributing Indigenous created videos on multiple channels. So you can go to asumatv.com and you can find a range on any given day of videos from multiple communities around the world spoken in various languages on topics from everything from climate change to sport to, you name it. You just go there every day and you can find something different, and it's really quite wonderful. So, as opposed to YouTube, Asuma TV's goal is to, quote, enable Indigenous people to express reality in their own views, in their own voices, views of the past, anxieties about the present, and hopes for a more decent and honorable future. So one of the things I love about that quote is it recognizes, again, what somebody else said yesterday. This is also about politics. We can't pretend that we don't know why some of these languages are endangered, or why would it be that people have anxieties about the present, about speaking their language, about forging ahead. So they put it right up front. And so to accomplish this, they have hundreds of individual community channels with programming, mainly in Indigenous languages, but not all, uploaded daily by people, creating a dialogue, and then they also have specific themes. So there might be a theme on mining, there might be a theme on climate change, where various Indigenous peoples from around the world would then come together to talk about that. So share that local knowledge to very global challenges, something like climate change, for example. So in addition to allowing for content creation within languages and recognizing the past and the history, they also provide digitizing. So they have a digitizing service that also focuses on preservation. So it's that balance between preservation and creation. It's never just one or the other. There tends to be a popular narrative about preservation when we talk about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous content, but it's also about creation, bringing those two things together. Similarly, the Plateau Peoples Web Portal, which is a project that I direct out of Washington State University, is a collaboratively curated online library archive that allows tribal community members in the Pacific Northwest across 3 states to share their own stories side by side with standard library metadata. So this is a collaboration between the librarians at WSU, myself, and currently 5 tribes with whom Washington State has memorandums of understanding. So the archive is arranged by key categories that the tribes decided on and produced themselves. This was really interesting. When I got there in 2005 and started working at WSU, and started talking to the tribes. Well, what do they want from us? We want access to your collections. But we just don't want, and they're scattered around 3 states, so how do we do that? Okay, so there's an online platform, we can do that. But we just don't want access to what you have, we want some control, we want some narrative. And I'll never forget, because one of the Umatilla women who was there, she said, we don't care if you keep what's already there, we just want our own say. So what she was saying is like, you already put the stuff up there, you know, that's already out there. Now we want to have our say, so when people come and look at it, they can see what we have to say about it as well. And I don't, you know, one of the things that they wanted really was to tag things and be able to categorize things by their own categories, what was important to them. So we originally started with 9 categories, and then we went up to 12. But the communities came together, and this took a process of about 6 months to decide, you know, just on these very basic categories, but it was from the communities themselves. How will we think this through? How will we think about these? And this was really as opposed to Library of Congress subject headings, which, you know, I have a PhD, and most of the time they don't make sense to me. I'm not sure how things are organized around Library of Congress subject headings. So the point is that these were localized taxonomies. So in the portal, we worked really hard to create a system that would highlight Indigenous voices while also maintaining the institutional record. So we weren't erasing anything. So in the portal, we have both. And this is one of my favorite examples from the portal. Now, the Smithsonian Institution is a partner of ours, and they've very generously given us hundreds of digital images from their collections. And you can see here that the title of this photo that comes from the Smithsonian is 3 Yakima Women. And the Yakima Nation is a tribe in the Pacific Northwest. This is very tame compared to other titles and other catalog records around the world that are often very disparaging, and, you know, we could all go through degrading, and we can sort of all go through those examples. But the point is, if you go to the Smithsonian, this is what you would find. 3 Yakima women, and then this is the metadata on the right. So that's what you would get as a person trying to find this. So then we took it to the tribal representatives, and what they do is fill out their own tribal catalog record. So now we have tribal knowledge, we have a tribal catalog record, and I can't even show you all the tribal knowledge that goes with this, because this particular page goes on for probably about 6 or 7 or 8 paragraphs. I mean, it's really in-depth. And then on the left, we also have the cultural narrative. So now we have the names of these 3 women. We have something about the dresses that they're wearing, why they would wear them, what the ceremonies are, how this relates to daily life, education, on and on and on. And tribal members can also, in addition to text, they can add audio or video. So what you have is you get a really rich, expanded record. It's a win-win. You know, the public wins, the tribe wins. Everybody wins because it's a very expanded record. We also provide Unicode 8, so tribes can type in their own languages if they want. All of these projects, and there's so many around the world, take different approaches to creating, organizing, and managing the vast amounts of digital material that are part of our daily lives. They intersect in every part of our lives, but they intersect with social and cultural and linguistic systems, and they do so in multiple ways. So if indeed curation is, quote, the big job of the next century, then we would do well to learn lessons from our past and the colonial histories that inform our current curation practices and preservation models. Indeed, it takes a little bit of historical amnesia to disregard the dubious collecting practices that have given us a lot of the material that populate national museums, libraries, and what we call the public domain by those who were strategically erased from that domain. So now they're being digitized and circulated, but how did they get there? Enduring Indigenous knowledge systems help us think differently about curation, creation, and knowledge management in our collecting institutions, our libraries, our archives, our museums, and what's more important, about our relationships with those home communities and their collections. The Plateau People's Web Portal isn't about adding more records, it's about the relationship that we have with those tribes at our institution. That's what's going to endure. That's why it took years. Because when the tribes first came to us, they said, why should we trust you? Why should we have our stuff on your servers? Why would I do that? And it was only over years and years that they started to see, we're not going to erase what you have. They have their own usernames and passwords. They upload tribal catalog records. Nobody at WSU will ever touch them. We can't erase them. We don't have passwords. But it took the time over years for them to start to see, if we put this content up, will somebody erase it? Will somebody edit it? Or is it really our voice that's there? Yeah, it's really your voice that's there. But, you know, for the histories of what's gone on in the United States, in Australia, in Canada, in any post-colonial nation, that trust is slow in coming. So it's not so much about the digital tools, they help, but it's about the relationships that they build. So Indigenous knowledge systems teach us as much about seeing as a form of knowing as not seeing, as a path to knowledge creation and circulation. And certainly it seems counterintuitive to Enlightenment notions of seeing as believing. However, if we look at the types of sociality that are deeply embedded in the relationships between people, places, and ancestors, we begin to see a process of visual access. So, for example, the Warramungu system of knowledge circulation is based on a continuum between open and closed. Very few things are either completely open or totally closed. It's a continuum of access that's based on several factors that include death, ritual status, one's country, kin groups, and gender. Now, none of this, because I'm speaking to an Australian crowd, is going to be something that's, you know, completely going to blow you away. You know this. So, for example, some songs, right, may only be accessible to a particular group of women who have relationships to certain ancestors at certain places and have certain initiation. Or a physical place on the land, a water hole, may only be used by certain male groups who have ritual responsibility, and then they pass that knowledge on. We could just keep going on and on and on. The point is that there are multiple social and cultural factors that go into the diffusion of knowledge, right? And its accessibility, and key, its constant renewal. It's not static. What Warramungu people really instilled in me is that knowledge can die, country can die, which is completely different than a Western paradigm. As you're moving, you know, as I have, up the educational ladder, it's supposed to be all there for me for the taking, right? It's a bootstrap mentality in the US. If I can pull myself up, I can learn it. That's not the case here. So how do we think about that within our digital systems? And these systems particularly disrupt the notion of this sort of open to the public mentality that insists on openness as a default and at all costs. So within the Warramungu community, they already had an analog solution for this particular way of thinking about open and closed. And I love this picture, and because it sort of speaks a thousand words when we're thinking about it. Here's a filing cabinet that's in the Ninkanunu Art and Cultural Center in the back room where the Warramungu communities worked, and it says, restricted, men only, permission applies, right? When I show this slide, particularly when I'm speaking to technologists, somebody just says, well, couldn't you just open it up as a woman? And, you know, if anybody's tried to get into filing cabinets like this, even if it is locked, right, it wouldn't be too hard. It wouldn't be too hard for me as a woman to get in there or some other woman to get in there. The point is that it's not that we couldn't, it's that the system here is one of a guidepost. It's a warning because the women don't want to. They know that those are things that are not for them to see. And it's very hard and troublesome feminists, you know, and it's like, it's not a punitive system. We're not talking about patriarchy because there's also women's business. There's a women's cabinet, exactly the same thing. Or if we think about where is women's business and men's business, it works together. You have to have both. So this isn't a punitive system. This isn't a hierarchical system. This is a collaborative system. So using this sort of alternative Warramungu understanding about access, we worked over several years with a range of community members to try to create something from that already existing offline system to something online. Or it wasn't online, it was digital. And the impetus for this was that we went to the National Archives in Darwin, and there were all kinds of things in their digital catalog that evoked very sort of emotional responses from a lot of the Warramungu community members, relatives they hadn't seen before, or, and these sorts of things happen over and over again, but there were also images that they didn't want to, that shouldn't have been online. And then, as we were coming back from Darwin and driving down to Tennant Creek, we stopped at a missionary's house. And this missionary is very much beloved by the community. And the missionary group had worked in Tennant Creek since the 30s up through the 80s. It really, had a positive impact. It wasn't a sort of negative thing. People wanted, let's stop, let's have a cup of tea, let's see him. When we got there, he took us into his back room and opened it up. And there he had begun this scanning project of all of the photos from the missionaries, from the 2 missionaries before him and up to him. So he had thousands of photos and had already scanned over 700 from the 30s to the 80s. So over the next few hours, he loaded those onto my MacBook Pro, and then it was sort of like, well, I don't want these. What are we going to do with these when we get them back to the community? People would come around my computer and look, so when you should look, everybody knew, oh, that's a picture of my country, I'll come and look. But it was very clunky and inconvenient, and how doesn't that work? So we worked to create Mukadu, which is a free and open source content management system. And it started off just as a community archive for the Warramungu community, the Mukadu Wumparani Kari Archive. And it grew over the last 5 years into an open source project for any Indigenous community.
We care about cultural content. Pictures, movies, oral histories, objects. They help us tell our stories, document meaningful moments in our lives, remember our ancestors and loved ones, and share our experiences with others. Memory institutions play an important role in curating cultural content for the long term. More and more often, they depend on content management software to assist in this monumental task. But what about digital culture? Unlike physical objects where access and use can be easily controlled, things are not so simple in the digital age. Current content management tools are challenged by the complexities of Indigenous digital heritage materials. Indigenous museums, archives, and libraries are underserved by industry standards over traditional knowledge systems. So how can technology help share and protect digital materials based on local protocols? Well, local protocols were the starting place for Mukadu CMS, a free and open source community digital archive platform powered by Drupal that delivers professional standards-based archiving specifically designed for Indigenous digital heritage. Wait a minute, Muka who? Mukadu. Mukadu is a Warramungu word meaning dilly bag, a safe-keeping place for valuable items and the knowledge about them. Materials in the dilly bag are managed through face-to-face interactions between community members who continuously add meaning to their cultural heritage. Mukadu CMS is a dilly bag for digital heritage. It provides archiving tools that are adaptable to local protocols and intellectual property systems. In other words, Mukadu allows you to manage your own digital heritage. It's flexible for your needs, lets you maintain your own cultural practices, and provides traditional knowledge licenses for content sharing. Mukadu is a set of digital tools that allows you to manage content culturally, socially, legally, and well, Drupally. Manage how? Establish categories for content following our predefined templates or customize to fit your needs. Set access parameters for members of your community and the public. Annotate and describe items in your own words. Filter content based on your cultural protocols. Choose traditional knowledge license options and define precisely how you want to share your digital heritage. So what are you waiting for? Join a growing community of Mukadu users who are passionate about solving digital heritage challenges. At mukadu.org, you can get the latest updates, discuss improvements, share solutions, and help Mukadu to adapt to your needs. It all begins at mukadu.org.
So that was, as I said, Mukurtu is free and open source, so there's no, I'm not trying to win over anybody here, but that's sort of our 30,000-foot view. And like I said, Mukurtu grew out of the needs of the Waramungu community. I'm not a technologist, I'm not a software developer, I was a cultural anthropologist, and I just happened to be stupid enough when the community members said, well, we should be able to do this, that I said, yeah, I'm sure we can. So 7 years later, here we are, and I am a software developer, and we have been doing this. So, you know, it grew out of this need, and as I started presenting on it after we installed it in Tennant Creek, I was getting phone calls every week, every month from Indigenous communities around the world that said, can we get it? Can we get it? And that's when I finally had to say, I guess I need to figure out a way that we can get this for more people. So it certainly wasn't something I set out to do, but the archive platform is like the dilly bag. It provides that safekeeping place. And the thing about the dilly bag is that the elders chose the name Mukurtu for the software, and it's Mukurtu obviously literally, as we said, means dilly bag, but they translated it to mean a safekeeping place. The dilly bag would hold sacred items. And if you wanted to be initiated, if you wanted to know some of that knowledge, you had to approach the elders. But the elders also had to open up that dilly bag. So it was about relationships, and it was about trust. And Mukurtu then is a digital tool that's built on the social articulation of trust. It's a content management system that begins and ends with Indigenous needs. It's first and foremost, it allows for multiple types of filters that provide that type of granular level of access based on community needs. So in the Waramungu example, those are kinship, gender roles, place-based relationships. You can change those within the system to whatever it is for your community. Users decide, and they can continually update, change, add, edit, and delete. This is what drives access internally within the system. So within the platform, any community, be it an Indigenous community, library, cultural center, museum, or even a family group, can customize their instance of Mukurtu with their own logo and welcome text. I'll be in New Zealand next week, and we're working with Te Papa to create a completely customized Maori version for their Maori collections. Importantly, so you can, as I said, you can localize this in your language. And then what's key, though, is you can define the cultural and sharing protocols to fit the ethical and social information management needs of whatever that community is. Okay, so right here, you'll see it, the cultural protocol. Here it is, and this was another thing, because I'm not a software engineer and I'm not a technologist. When I went and started working with engineers and technologists, I said, we're working with a community that has low levels of literacy and low levels of digital literacy. So I gave them a 2-click mantra. I said, if anything in the system takes more than 2 clicks, we're done. We lost the people, they're not going to come back. And this is the other thing about the tools that we're talking about. The tool's not going to save the language, the tool's not going to preserve the culture, the tool's not going to make sure that these, things get archived or saved or performed again. The people, and probably all of you have seen computers or computer labs or tools in Aboriginal communities that nobody uses. They're in the back room, they're unplugged, because the community, it's not a grassroots effort, it's not what they want, or it's too difficult. You can't use it, there's not the training. So for us, the educational component, as well as making something that is very user-friendly. So to change or to add a cultural protocol, there it says cultural protocol, you type the name, so here it could be youth, and then you can give it a description, whatever it is that you want, and then this links, which is very key for us, to what we call sharing protocols. Okay, and you'll see the sharing protocols there. Sharing protocols combine to define the circulation routes of the material within the archive. So we have 3 types of sharing protocols. There's open, and that means accessible to any user of the archive. The archive can be online or offline. The archive in Tennant Creek is offline. They did not want it online. We work with the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. They want theirs online and offline. You can do a combination. So again, you can run it on your own server, you can run it on a hosted server, you can run it locally on your computer. These were all considerations, particularly that grew out of, because it came from remote place in Australia, These considerations I already knew, and then we sort of mapped them out globally. So you have open. The second type of sharing protocol is what we call community. Now that's accessible to only the groups that are tagged for that piece of content. So this is an or relationship. So let me give you an example. So you may have set up cultural protocols in your archive for gender and dreaming. This might be some of the ways that you do it. So if a piece of content is tagged with gender male or is tagged with the bird dreaming, anybody in either of those groups will be able to see what that piece of content is if it's tagged with that community sharing protocol. But what we found is that for some pieces of content, we needed a more tightly controlled type of access. So we added the third sharing protocol, which is called strictly community. And this is an and relationship, whereby one would have to be both male and part of the bird dreaming to be able to see that piece of content. And I can say, the Mukurtu is built on Drupal, which is a content management system that some of you might know, as our base layer. Drupal is used in thousands of countries around the world. It's used on hundreds of thousands of websites, including whitehouse.gov and Amnesty International and all these types of things. There's just so many instances of it. This type of access control did not exist within Drupal. The developers that we hired created this, and we released it back to the community. It's open source. So the tool is open, the content is not. That's the difference there, right? So we want this tool to be able to be used and the infrastructure to be able to use, but then the community decides how that content and that knowledge is circulated. So this allows community members to reflect their own local values and ethical frameworks of obligation within the digital system, right? So Mukurtu CMS is not only about sharing content, it's also about curation. So this is for the circulation, right? But then also there's the curation component. So how can community members curate and narrate that content side by side with metadata from the archives or libraries or museums where they get a lot of this content back? So think of all that material that came back to Tennant Creek. So within Mukurtu CMS, we have the option of creating digital heritage. And again, it's as easy as selecting a media item on your desktop, on any folder in your computer. We also have a batch import function. And then users define the metadata that's important to them through what we labeled Mukurtu Core. It's a little play on Dublin Core for the librarians in the group, but it's the little things in life that keep you going during software development. So Mukurtu Core are preset fields that allow community members to curate and narrate their digital heritage in, again, 4 easy steps, and this is something that, again, this has been in development for the last 5 years. So the first thing are those categories. That's a lesson that we learned from the Plateau People's Web Portal, which is also a tongue twister. The portal came before Mukurtu, but now Mukurtu is the software that powers the portal. But that is something that we learned and we also built into Mukurtu. So just as you create cultural protocols within the system, you also create categories. So whoever sets up the archive can add whatever categories in whatever language they want, so that when a user from that community is using it, when they search, they're going to get things that make sense to them, because it's a taxonomy, it's a system that already works for them. Then once you do that, there's the second thing, cultural narratives. So again, unlike that short description, 3 Yakima women, cultural narrative can be, we have an unlimited field here. It can be text, it can be audio, it can be video. Another lesson that we learned from Tennant Creek was that elders who were very verbose about, the content, because of literacy issues, when you sat them down in front of a computer, either somebody else had to be typing or they would be very silent. So we added the audio and video components. So instead of typing in text, you can upload an audio file that an elder, or a video, whatever it is. And we left that completely open. And then, of course, there's the cultural and sharing protocols. That's what makes up Mukadu Core. Those were the things that highlighted the Indigenous concerns that we found for the content management system. But we also worked with librarians and archivists and museum curators, and so we also have standard metadata. Okay? So you have Mukadu Core that reflects the Indigenous concerns. The next step is adding standard metadata. We have Dublin Core, MARC, and EAD at the moment. As I said, we're just now getting to 1.0, and so we'll be adding other crosswalks as we work with institutions. We work with the National Museum of the American Indian, and we've created a crosswalk for them. But what this allows is that then communities can easily talk to and communicate with and share and exchange collections with other repositories. So just like the instance that I showed you in the Plateau People's web portal, if the Smithsonian wants to work with a community who has an instance of Mukadu, they can do that automatically. They can batch export directly into Mukadu, and we've already done that many times. It's by something that we came up with called Round Trip. So we're very sort of proud of Round Trip because it's not just about collections and metadata, it's about fostering those relationships between the communities. So if let's take the Cherokee, perhaps the Cherokee will want to use something like Mukadu, and they want to partner with the National Museum of the American Indian, and they have 10,000 records in their collection, in their instance of Mukadu that they've named, whatever they want to name it, and they want to export some of those back to the National Museum of the American Indian. Very easily, through just a tick box, they can check off, we want everything to go except our traditional knowledge. So that traditional knowledge might be something that they don't want to share. They want to keep only in their instance of Mukadu for the community members who have access to it. But they want to share the cultural narratives. They want to share the maps. They want to share the rest of it back with the public. So it encourages sharing, but it doesn't demand sharing as openness. Openness is only one type of sharing. So it allows for the community to have the controls over the collections like they've not had in the past. Mukadu CMS also makes traditional knowledge central by giving it a place of prominence within Mukadu Core. This is not a comment section. And this is what you find in a lot of content management systems that libraries pay hefty sums for, tens of thousands of dollars. Oh, we have a comment section, so anybody can leave a comment. Indigenous people can just leave a comment. But we know traditional knowledge is not a comment. It's something that we want integrated, highlighted right in the fore. So it has its own tab within Mukadu Core. And again, we made this a very flexible field because while we don't know what form traditional knowledge takes, what we found is that almost every piece of content had traditional knowledge associated with it. So again, audio, video, text, whatever it is. And then finally, users can choose their own licensing. And this is something that came about directly with working with the Warramungu because they were having problems with people taking their stuff, using their stuff, and they said, well, let's just put a copyright on it. And we'll talk about the limitations of that. But what we have within the system are we have three choices. So you have your traditional copyright, all rights reserved. You also have the Creative Commons, or you have what we have created and are under development now, are traditional knowledge licenses and labels. Now, this is an alternative model to the traditional copyright and Creative Commons that really only focuses on individuals.
People have always used their knowledge to make things like books, photographs, sound recordings, and works of art. We all use and reuse these things for many reasons: to expand our knowledge, to represent the world around us, to share our world with others, to sell, or to trade. Copyright is a set of rights granted to someone who makes things with knowledge. Copyright is a funny but complicated system of law. It protects some things, but not all things, and it has time periods for protection that can expire. When they expire, there is no protection, and people can use this material however they want. The copyright system began as a legal way to define who did and did not have certain rights to reproduce books. Since then, our society has changed a lot. Digital objects are just another class of knowledge materials. And now with the internet, digital objects can circulate quickly and be accessed by more people. The folks at Creative Commons saw that the traditional all rights reserved copyright system didn't fit with the new ways that this material was being made, reused, remixed, and circulated. They wanted to refine the way copyright worked. Listening to and learning from how artists, software designers, and musicians wanted to make, share, and sell their creations, Creative Commons came up with a set of licenses that allowed individuals to more clearly control how their knowledge objects are accessed and shared. But there is a lot of material that was made over the last 200 years by scholars or missionaries who worked in Indigenous communities. Most of this material is now in museums and archives. Although many people are working hard to return this material and its digital surrogates to source communities, there are some problems with its legal status. Indigenous communities who are in these photographs or recordings have no special rights to this material, regardless of its content, and law no longer protects some of this material. Also, some materials were made collaboratively and collectively by communities of people, or sometimes they were handed down through generations and no one author could or should be identified. Ownership and authorship in the Western legal sense just don't always fit with how Indigenous cultural materials were made or can be accessed. And yet, Indigenous peoples want ways to manage and control these materials. Listening to the needs of Indigenous communities and working with lawyers, we created a set of traditional knowledge licenses that recognize that Indigenous communities have different access and use expectations in regards to their knowledge and cultural material. These licenses show us that the use of specific material might require special permission and appropriate acknowledgement from the source community. Traditional knowledge licenses work with traditional all rights reserved copyright or Creative Commons licenses. They are additional agreements that acknowledge that with some material, special rules governing access and use of that material also exist. With these new traditional knowledge licenses, Indigenous communities can help determine what these rules are and how to make these rules in keeping with already existing community practice. Traditional knowledge licenses ask all new users of this special material to respect Indigenous protocols and laws that govern their cultural heritage materials, and to understand that some materials are sensitive, have restrictions, and are not free to be used by anyone at any time. Traditional knowledge licenses ask us all to gather, create, share, responsibly, and respectfully.
Hence the title today. So the licenses and labels provide another option. And again, I'm not a lawyer. We're working with lawyers. We're also working with WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, on this project, and just presented at their IGC in Geneva a couple weeks ago. The licenses are meant to and will be legally defensible across multiple jurisdictions. The problem is, what I mentioned before, and that we all know because of the colonial collecting history, what's in the public domain or owned by third parties, you can't license again. So while we have the licenses, what we also came up with are labels. And what we thought here is labels will function as social and educational tools, much like a fair trade stamp. You know that the coffee that you're buying is fair trade. So the labels will be a guide for proper use. So it says, you know, it will say something, it works off of sort of that Aboriginal notion of shame, you know. When in our community, only women should view this, and this is why. And you know what? I really do believe, and I'm not necessarily Pollyanna in any way or necessarily glass half full, but I present enough and I talk to enough people that they say, I didn't even know. I wouldn't have even. I think 90% of people want to do the right thing, but they don't know what it is. I mean, I teach to, you know, cultural anthropology to students, and they just have no idea. And they live very close to Native American communities in my home state, you know, in Washington. They just have no idea that these things are out there. So the labels will function as that sort of educational tool, and it allows the communities to say, hey, this is how we use it. We hope you kind of won't be a jerk. We hope you'll use it this way too, you know. And of course, then, you know, in the other instances, they will be able to use the licenses for material that they own and create themselves, which that material will grow as Indigenous communities are making their content right now, that they will be able to use those traditional knowledge licenses themselves. So once you get all of that in, I know it's been like 20 slides since I started with that first, when you upload a piece of content in, you get all of that in there. Then what happens when, as a user, you go to your instance of Mukurtu and you log in, you get this sort of experience on this view page. The metadata on the right is first and foremost the metadata that's important to Indigenous communities. This isn't where the standard metadata is. On here, this is where you get the communities, the categories, and then the traditional knowledge, the cultural narratives, the licensing, and the maps. Maps are something I didn't touch on, but mapping is very important. So in this case, much like I said with the Plateau People's web portal, we highlight this sort of multiple layers of any piece of content, and we bring that together with the standard metadata. Communities can also relate any single item within this archive to any other multiple items, and that's something that we found is very popular because we all know here that knowledge isn't in one item. There might be a picture of a bag, a song about the bag, a video of an elder talking about the bag. All those things are related, and you can view them as a digital heritage collection, something that because of time I won't talk about today, but you could go to our website and see that. So in this way, we think that Mukurtu CMS balances sort of the hopes and the needs of Indigenous communities with the ethical models that already exist within their communities and the technology in the digital environment. So at Mukurtu, we believe in building tools that allow communities to define and decide how to manage, preserve, and share their knowledge without compromising their local values. That is, we think that technology should bend to the needs and particular social and ethical systems of Indigenous people and not the other way around, which is usually what we ask for. Amongst the largely technocentric narratives about the digital ecosystem that I began with, Indigenous models of knowledge circulation demonstrate a way to ground us in the needs of people, localized in places that matter to them, surrounded by the languages they speak, and within the communities they value. The digital is only a platform, it's not a solution. In all the cases I cited today, collaborating is driven by Indigenous needs that made connecting to collections, knowledge, and people part of an already existing Indigenous cultural system that are all part of creating a future that makes the digital a more humane and ethical place for all of us. Thank you.